On today's World Insight, with the much anticipated Trump-Kim summit less than 12 hours away, we find out how the final preparations from both sides will shape the meeting. And we speak to the former lead U.S. negotiator at the six-party talks. Ambassador Christopher Hill draws upon his experience to envision the outcomes of the DPRK-U.S. meeting. And to better comprehend the upcoming summit, we explore the personalities of Trump and Kim. Do they have what it takes to strike a deal?
Hello, I'm Tian Wei in Singapore, bringing you the latest on the World Insight Special. The once tourist-bound country Singapore is now gearing up to host one of the most important meetings of the year, the DPRK-U.S. Summit. Many pin their hope on this to restart a long-delayed process to resolve the Korean Peninsula nuclear issue. However, with complicated geopolitical situation and more than unique styles of the two leaders, can things be done? World Insight will be here for days to cover the latest from the summit. First of all, take a look at this.
The key players are in place in Singapore. DPRK leader Kim Jong-un arriving first, and Air Force One, carrying U.S. President Donald Trump, landed on Sunday. The June 12th summit in Singapore will be the first ever between a sitting U.S. president and a DPRK leader.
The ultimate objective we seek from diplomacy with North Korea has not changed. The complete, verifiable, and irreversible denuclearization of the Korea Peninsula is the only outcome that the United States will accept. Sanctions will remain until North Korea completely and verifiably eliminates its weapons of mass destruction programs. If diplomacy does not move in the right direction, and we are hopeful that it will continue to do so, those measures will increase.
Since assuming office, Kim has become a young, dynamic leader that seems to be changing the DPRK. His administration has tested more missiles and nuclear weapons than his predecessors, and he has presided over an economic boom in Pyongyang. Despite his youth and relative inexperience, Kim was reportedly well informed on every major issue during his meetings with his South Korean counterpart. Trump is nearly twice Kim's age and can never be accused of paying too much attention to detail. But some analysts are drawing parallels between the two, arguing it's possible that these two leaders will click.
They have some very similar traits and similar backgrounds to the point where I think if they got in a room together, they would actually get along quite well. If the U.S. allows Trump to be Trump and he goes in with his deal-maker mode, I think there is stuff that could be done and a relationship that could be built that could set us down a diplomatic path.
There is optimism that Tuesday's summit can improve ties and ultimately achieve denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. Singapore provides a historic chance for Trump to forge a working relationship with Kim.
For more on the preview of DPRK-U.S. Summit and a wrap-up of exactly what happened today on Monday on the eve of the summit, we are joined here in Singapore studio. Sang-Oh, who is a senior advisor for the international affairs at the Asia Strategy and Leadership Institute, welcome. And also we are joined by Shang Ho, associate research fellow at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies with Nanyang Technological University. Welcome to both of you. So, gentlemen, let's jump directly into the latest development. On Monday, a lot of things happened. Let's talk about the U.S. first. Mike Pompeo, Secretary of State of the U.S., talking about denuclearization on the Korean Peninsula. He's also talking about reducing sanctions if talks go well, but increases if the summit didn't tomorrow. So what would that mean?
I think this is really the last push by the U.S. to state very clearly what are the last terms and conditions it wants leading up to the summit tomorrow, and to see what is the North Korean reaction before the summit.
The North Koreans didn't react much, at least not in public.
Well, of course, we are hoping that Mr. Kim tomorrow will have somewhat of a surprise for us. But I think that is certainly possible because even his first peace gesture about half a year ago, that was totally almost unexpected. So let's see what he would offer tomorrow.
However, DPRK news agency did suggest very clearly in their scripts about what kind of expectations they are having for Tuesday's summit. They talk about denuclearization. They talk about peace. They also talk about new type of relationship with the United States. So all of those messages actually are very interesting, even if you look at the word.
I would actually focus on the so-called new type of relationship.
Why?
Because I think for tomorrow's summit, the perhaps only achievable, tangible results will actually be a somewhat normalization of relationship between North Korea and the United States. For example, setting out liaison officers in each other's capitals and so on. To talk about denuclearization at this point, I think it's a little bit premature.
Of course, Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State of the U.S., did caution that denuclearization would not be able to be achieved with just one summit of 24 hours or even less, but rather a process. And yet we know the interpretation of denuclearization is very different.
The DPRK version and the American version are very different, and the fact that Mike Pompeo, Secretary of State, came up this afternoon to again say that the U.S. has only one version of denuclearization, CVID, the well-known term.
Right.
I think that shows very clear the U.S. position.
Complete, verifiable,
Irreversible
denuclearization. Exactly. And of course, that has to be agreed by the DPRK side as well.
Well, that can be a sort of a common goal to be achieved, let's say in a year or 2 years or 3 years' time, right? And then in the process, you know, there'll be step by step moving towards that particular goal. I think at this summit, if we can have that kind of somewhat of a commitment, we should be very happy already.
Yes, we should be very happy already, but at the same time, you should see that it is not just in the summit, but all the interactions among the leaders of the earlier six-party talks. If you look at what President Trump of the United States did today, he called his counterpart, South Korean and the Japanese as well, talking about something that they did not necessarily reveal in detail. So what do you think this kind of interaction, how it will help the United States to define its agenda for tomorrow? Or Washington is having its own plan, it's already been ironed out?
I think this is also a move by Washington, D.C. to kind of have last-minute consultations with its close allies, Republic of Korea and Japan, prior to tomorrow's summit. Obviously, both of these allies will raise their concerns to America.
Yeah, and the DPRK, South Korea, they are having the military talks. 2 days from now, they are going to reveal to each other the delegations' names. So a lot of development are going on all at the same time. This is exciting.
Oh, very exciting, and it's almost impossible to catch up with every minute. Things are happening so quickly.
Yeah, but what would that mean? I mean, at the same time, almost parallel military discussion.
Well, because this Kim-Trump summit is but one segment of the eventual peace process on the Korean Peninsula and beyond, I think we're actually looking at perhaps a regrouping of the six parties talk. For example, Kim is talking to the various regional leaders, and then at one point, I think it will be, for me at least, I'm foreseeing a huge summit grouping together all the neighboring leaders as well as the United States, and even, only then perhaps we can have a more comprehensive peace process.
Right. Later in our program, I had an exclusive interview with Mr. Christopher Hill, who is the U.S. ambassador to South Korea earlier, and also the head of the U.S. delegation to the six-party talks. He certainly talked about exactly the points that, gentlemen, you just mentioned. But having said that, though, China's role, Mr. Hill did talk about China was having this long desire to have the DPRK and the U.S. to sit down together to talk as much as possible, but yet situations did not manage to make it happen. So now they will.
Oh yeah, I think China is very happy to see that. So happy that China is landing an aircraft to ferry Mr. Kim to Singapore, right? So I think this Kim-Trump summit is not only a meeting between the two leaders, but it's also the, shall we say, the collective wish of various regional countries.
And collective
so that,
efforts as well,
that's right,
one would say.
Indeed, yeah.
But having said that, though, we do have the latest information coming from Iran, with the Iranian side warning the DPRK side, don't take the Americans' words seriously because deal with the United States actually scrap off as a result of recent U.S. withdrawal from the nuclear talks and the nuclear deal of Iran?
Well, I think from the U.S. perspective, that Iran nuclear deal was not the so-called CVID type of deal. It's more like Iran temporarily giving up some parts of the nuclear programs and so on. And from a U.S. point of view, at least this administration point of view, that's not enough.
What do you think? So will this kind of warning DPRK take seriously?
I mean, surely the DPRK has noted what Iran has experienced over the last few weeks and also its latest statement. And I think these calculations would definitely factor into the DPRK's thinking in tomorrow's summit as well, for sure.
So which take us to the very original question. Why would the DPRK want to denuclearize? And why would the DPRK, even after, let's just say, a good summit, take seriously what Americans said on the summit?
Well, of course, this is a really historic opportunity to resolve this problem, given the stars are aligned at the moment. You know, both parties want to come for talks. There is a good chance that tomorrow we will see a good outcome. And I think, you know, this is really a once-in-a-lifetime chance that, you know, the parties will really look at seriously.
All right. Well, thank you so much for right now, the latest analysis. A lot of information coming in all the time. I'll see you tomorrow and the day after tomorrow.
Wow,
thank you.
Look forward to that.
You are watching our special program of CGTN World Insight with Tianwei, coming to you directly from Singapore. We'll be back after this. One of the world's biggest diplomatic deadlocks, security flashpoints, and humanitarian crisis. It takes everyone's hard work, beginning with real efforts from these two. The Kim-Trump summit, a pivotal moment, and a possible game changer. Catch our special program from Singapore, the DPRK U.S. Summit, only on World Insight with Tianwei. Welcome back. I'm Tianwei here in Singapore, bringing you all the latest on the DPRK U.S. Summit. The hotel behind me, Shangri-La, is well known for being the venue of hosting the premier defense forum of Asia, the Shangri-La Dialogue. Now it is adding one more colorful page to its history, being the place where U.S. President Donald Trump apparently is living in Singapore for the DPRK U.S. Summit. Despite of the fact that Donald Trump withdrew the United States from the Iran nuclear deal, he apparently is determined to make things happen with the Korean Peninsula nuclear issue. However, according to Christopher Hill, the U.S. head of the delegation for the six-party talks, who later served as the U.S. ambassador to South Korea, it takes more than just a series of strong worded tweets, but flexibility, determination, and strong negotiation skills to make things happen. Let's listen in to my exclusive interview with Christopher Hill. The talk in Singapore, what do you think are the goals of each of the two sides?
I think the U.S. really needs to see some progress on the nuclear weapons, and I suspect the North Koreans want some progress on their economies. They indicated they're prepared to talk about it, but talking about something and doing something are two different things, so we'll have to see.
During the time when you were the head of the six-party talks U.S. delegation, what were the things that the U.S. already offered to DPRK at different stages?
They said, we want economic assistance. I said, we can work with you on that. They said, we want energy assistance. I said, we could work with you on that. They said they wanted a peace treaty to replace the armistice on the Korean Peninsula. And I said, together with some other countries, we can work with you on that. They said, we want an end to your military exercises in South Korea. And I said, we cannot work with you on that. We're not going to have a situation where our trying to work with you ends up weakening our alliance with South Korea. So we had some agreement and some disagreements, and we tried to go forward on that basis.
Do you think there is also a bottom line for the current administration when they're dealing with the DPRK?
Well, it's difficult sometimes, but what is clear to me is President Trump really does want to make progress on this, And what's also clear, and I'm pleased to see, is he's a little flexible. Because, you know, when you deal with something like this, you can't just tell someone to do it, unfortunately. You have to work with them, and there has to be some give and take. And so I think he understands that. And so I was pleased to hear him say, look, this is a process. It's going to take some time.
What eventually has led to the breakdown of the latest rounds of six-party talks?
I tried a lot. I tried to push the process. And North Korea did not give us a full means to verify. So I couldn't take that back to the States and say, hey, I've succeeded in getting a partial verification. Well, partial verification wasn't going to impress anyone in the States. So we had to stop. And we were thinking, well, maybe when our new president came in, that is Barack Obama, maybe the North Koreans would be interested in starting the process again with President Obama, but they never were. And it was kind of discouraging. Instead, they announced that they no longer agree with the six-party process. They then did a nuclear test. So it was, and they then put nuclear weapons into their constitution. So it was not terribly helpful.
When you judge exactly what the DPRK wanted at that time, was it denuclearization so that the DPRK could come back to the international community, or a temporary halt to the lack of economic resources they have?
In fact, it was China's contribution to talk about a process that was action for action. So I felt it was unrealistic, as some Americans had believed in the past, to say, North Korea, you have to do everything, and then maybe we'll think about it and do something. I told Secretary Rice that is not going to work. That is simply not going to work. So we had to have a situation where the North Koreans would do something, we would do something, they would do something else, we would do something. And that was very important to overcome trust problems. Because if we gave them everything to help their economy, how would we know that they'd want to get rid of their nuclear weapons? They've already had their economic assistance. So we had to do it step by step with a tight sequencing of actions.
Will that still work?
I think it's the right way to go. Now, President Trump has said they should do everything, and then he will support relieving the sanctions. But I think, realistically speaking, we're going to have a schedule of things North Korea does, and a schedule of things the rest of us do, and try to match up that schedule and do things on a step-by-step basis. And I think that's fair. You cannot expect North Korea to give up these weapons for nothing, or to give up these weapons for a promise. But you cannot expect us to depend on North Korean promise.
At the very beginning of the negotiations, six-party talks you participated, you were suggesting to the United States officials back in Washington that things would not happen between the U.S. side and the DPRK side without the presence of the Chinese. But of course, later things have changed. As you said, that there are a lot of things like a bilateral, trilateral, quadrilateral.
At the beginning, there was an expectation that the Chinese had to be there in the room. And the DPRK did not want that. They did not want that. And
what do you mean by they did not want that?
They did not want to have China there as their babysitter while we were talking to them and have China there. They wanted the ability to talk to the U.S. delegation without another delegation there. And to me, that seemed reasonable. And so I sought from Washington kind of different guidance. It just seemed if I needed to see Kim Dae-gwan, I shouldn't have to do that with China in the room.
All right. And eventually, it did. I mean, in a way that you could talk to all sides.
Yeah, it worked.
Freely.
It worked.
It worked. And the Chinese side did not have any opposition toward this.
No, I think the Chinese side very much wanted to get the U.S. and DPRK delegations in a room, lock the door, and hope that we reached an agreement. Yeah.
How did you work with the Chinese side? In other words, what role do you think, Mr. Ambassador, during the six-party talks, the last three rounds that you participated, the role of China in the overall situation?
Well, to be very frank, China was extremely important to this entire process. China controlled the pen. So when we had agreements such as the September '05 statement, or the February '07 statement, or the October '07 statement, these statements were written by the Chinese. So China had a very deep responsibility to try to understand what the U.S. wanted, what the North Koreans wanted, what the Japanese wanted, because sometimes the Japanese had specific issues that they were interested in. So it was a responsibility to try to bring in all these different perspectives. And I think China did it very well, and I think all the people, Chinese, who watched this should have been very proud to see what the Chinese delegation did.
Mr. Ambassador, one thing is the leadership has changed.
Yes.
The DPRK leadership has changed from an older generation to the current younger generation.
Yes.
In your country, of course, it's a very different president, and he has his very unique personality.
That's very kind of you to point out. Yeah.
Will that make a difference?
I think our president is someone who wants to see results, and I think he's prepared to take risks to get results. I think he's unconventional. You know, when I was doing this, I had people say, well, you got to do this, this, and this before you do that. I think the president will be more focused on getting something done. So in a way, that will be good. But in other ways, he doesn't have a lot of experience in these diplomatic matters. And I think you do need patience. I think sometimes China has too much patience, but I would admit that the U.S. sometimes has too little patience.
Has the president consulted you before?
No, he's not. He's not.
Do you know
some of his
the
team,
people that he has consulted at all?
I don't, but some of his team have consulted with me, and that's the advice I've given them.
When was the time?
Oh, I've talked to members of his team within the last 2 weeks.
What about the DPRK leader? I mean, this is a new generation. It's a generation that even studied and lived abroad. And this is also a generation, you see, there's a sea change. The DPRK now has the nuclear weapon capabilities and the ICBM, which could reach the continental United States. So this is a sea change compared to your time, sir. Do you think this would make a difference?
Not to me.
Why not?
The fact that they have it does not mean to me that we have to allow them to have it or that we have to support them in having it. All that means to me is we have to work even harder, and we have to work with, I think, a real consistency of purpose. And I very strongly believe it cannot be solved by the U.S. It cannot be solved by China. China cannot say, you solve it, America. We cannot say, you solve it, China. But together, we should be able to deal with this. And I strongly support the idea of getting back together, maybe the day after June 12th, maybe starting on June 13th. China, the U.S., the other countries, and let's try to work together, because this problem is a serious problem, and we cannot accept, the U.S. cannot accept a country pointing nuclear weapons at us, a country that has come out of nowhere to point nuclear weapons.
Earlier, it is mainly senior-level diplomats like you who are talking to one another when it comes to six-party talks. But now we are seeing a very different approach, a top-down approach, from the heads of state going down to the next level. Do you think this approach will make a difference?
It's kind of high risk, because after all, if the two leaders can't reach an agreement, what's going to happen? It'll go back to diplomats? I'm not so sure. So I think it's very high risk. But on the other hand, I think it really shows the importance, the central importance that the U.S. attaches to this problem. And I hope the North Koreans understand that the U.S. has a lot of options, but we don't have the option of just forgetting about it and not worrying about it. We have to work with others and work with the DPRK to solve this problem.
Now, it's very quick preparation.
Yeah.
It's efficient, but the impact of the efficiency needs to be tested eventually.
I think people need to understand that we are not giving them all this relief and getting nothing. They are taking some steps, we are taking some steps, and I think that has to be carefully explained to people.
If those steps are being articulated. A seasoned negotiator and a witness of history, what do you think are those steps? By the way, circumstances have changed. The North Koreans already got the capabilities.
First of all, when you say they have the capabilities, they sure do. It is a danger. But just because they have the capabilities doesn't mean we have to accept it. Doesn't mean we have to say, oops, too late, you have capabilities, you can be a nuclear state. We don't need to accept it. But you're right. The
So you're saying the
tougher.
United States will never accept a nuclear DPRK?
Yes, I am saying that. And never is a long time. I rarely use the word never, but I use it in this case because we cannot accept it.
I see. What is the best scenario you could see out of this very brief interaction between the top leaders of the United States and DPRK?
If I could say the best scenario, it would be that North Korea agrees to give up its nuclear ambitions and invites the U.S. to take part in a process that includes other countries who have a direct interest in the whole issue of Northeast Asian security. Those countries happen to be the countries that are in the six-party process. So my best scenario is we have a good meeting on June 12th, and on the 13th, we get back to a broader meeting with other countries, because as I've said, we're not going to be able to do this without the other countries, because the issue of nuclear weapons, the issue of security in Northeast Asia is not an issue just for the United States or just for the DPRK.
What about the worst scenario?
Well, worst scenarios are things I don't like to think about. But a worse
you
scenario...
You have to think about it.
I do. But I think a worse scenario would be in North Korea that says we will not give up our nuclear weapons, because that puts us in a very difficult position. Somehow we need to make sure that worst scenario does not happen.
What about the U.S. has nothing to offer in the negotiation? That could also lead to the worst scenario.
I think you're right, but I think we do have things to offer.
Still to come on our program, in under 24 hours, the first meeting between the leaders of the DPRK and the U.S. will take place. Can the summit lead to the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula? Or will it be an extravagant icebreaker?
One of the world's biggest diplomatic deadlocks, security flashpoints, and humanitarian crisis. It takes everyone's hard work, beginning with real efforts from these two. The Kim-Trump summit, a pivotal moment, a possible game changer. Catch our special program from Singapore, the DPRK U.S. Summit, only on World Insight with Tian Wei. Welcome back. I'm Tian Wei. You're watching our special program from Singapore on the DPRK U.S. Summit. The summit is such a high-stake meeting that you can see the journalists around me. They're coming from all over the world. It's believed more than 2,500 of them are here in Singapore to cover the event. The reason they are here is not just for the event itself, but also the impact of the result of the negotiation between the DPRK and the United States, and what is going to be its ramifications for the rest of the world. On that topic, I've been talking to a panel of scholars. Let's listen in to what they have to say. And we are joined here in our special studio here in Singapore by Lin Tan-Wai, who is an adjunct research fellow at the National University of Singapore. Welcome, sir.
Thank you.
And good to see you here in Singapore.
Nice to see you too.
And Graham Webb, who is a research fellow at Najaratnam School of International Studies with Nanyang Technology University. Welcome as well. After a very long and dramatic day, gentlemen, we are here. What do you think are some of the indicators that we are going to read for tomorrow, whether that summit is a success or failure? Tan-Wai.
I think the very fact that the summit is taking place is a success by itself. And there are three indicators that we can watch out for.
Like what?
Number one, during the summit itself whether there will be a definition for denuclearization. This is probably at the core of the issue itself.
Right.
Can the two parties who have different ideas about denuclearization come together and compromise on a new one or hybrid one?
Denuclearization
Yes.
definition. And what about the second?
The second one is something that has been talked about for a very long time. We've heard about the Libyan model. This was rejected by Pyongyang in very strong words.
And rejected by Trump too. He
And,
said that's
and
not
later on
gonna be
rejected by
allowed.
Trump. That's why he came up with the Trump model. And the Trump model is based on CVID, complete verification, irreversible denuclearization. And the Trump model also is a little bit pragmatic. It wants to exchange certain things. So if Pyongyang is willing to give up its nuclear program, they are willing to bring, in the words of Mr. Mike Pompeo and President Trump, they're willing to bring North Korea's economic development to the same level as South Korea.
All right. See the tit for tat kinds of reaction with one another.
That's
And
right.
what about the third point?
And the third one is what has been proposed by Pyongyang, which is a synchronous and a phased withdrawal model. Sometimes it's known as a phased withdrawal model. Simply means that for everything that Pyongyang gives up, it requires something in return from the US. So I think these two models and other issues will probably be tossed around. And in eventuality, if there was success in the meeting, it's probably a hybrid kind of a model that comes up from these kind of models that have been thrown
Graham,
around.
is Tanwai expecting too much out of one meeting of a few hours here in Singapore after 20 years delay of the solution?
Well, I think he may be, because all these issues are extremely complicated, and it's difficult to work it out in just 1 or 2 days. I mean, it's been taking years to work these things out.
Yeah. So if there's one thing that you are looking at, what would that be?
I think in the least they need to agree on what constitutes denuclearization. That's been debated for the last few weeks. It needs to be clarified. There needs to be common ground, and I think that will be where the locus of the discussion will be.
Now, there are different reports about what will be the achievement, whether there will be a statement, a joint declaration, or even something more than that. Do you think that could happen? If that didn't happen, will that be a failure?
I reiterate that the fact that the summit is even taking place in the instance of 12th of June is a success by itself. But having said that, I think many leaders are very pragmatic and practical about the outcome. We've seen the statements in the 32nd ASEAN Summit and the Trilateral Summit in Tokyo. All regional leaders are supportive of the peace process and the summit itself. But many, if not all, are pragmatic about the outcome. So at best, I think we can look forward to a kind of joint declaration that opens a positive atmosphere for officials at different levels to talk to each other after the summit.
This is interesting because you are talking about more of a multilateral style, all officials. That's interesting, a phrase you just used. But will it be the future plan? Bilateral only, or are we looking at starting from a bilateral U.S. and the DPRK, and then move on to a much more complex and yet necessary process? Graham.
I'm actually for the second approach, and this is precisely why we're having the summit in the first place. I think it's been a long time coming. These two sides, the heads of state of the DPRK and the United States, have never met before, and they need to work out some of their bilateral issues first before we bring all the other stakeholders in the room. I agree. At the end of the day, all 6 parties need to work together in concert to come to a resolution, because you cannot leave any one party out.
President Trump has been talking about from the very beginning, bilateral, unilateral, not necessarily multilateral. On this one, he will be?
Well, the core of Mr. Trump's diplomacy is that there's no policy. What characterizes his diplomacy is transactional diplomacy. He's very flexible, very pragmatic. He changes according to the scenario. And I think he has sort of put the America's interests first in that sense. So I think he will respond to what he sees are the dynamics of the situation. There's no dogmatism about his way of thinking or the way that he achieves certain goals. But eventually what the U.S. wants to see is complete denuclearization. How the route reaches denuclearization in the end, the eventual end, will depend on pragmatism and practicality.
Pragmatism, what kinds of pragmatism? Probably we need to define that too. You see, Graham, from the two sides, the U.S. side mainly talking about it, saying, well, there are possibilities like this. However, no action. And yet you see DPRK side, apparently there were some action. So you see a very different style of how the two approach this, Graham. So what would this mean?
Well, to me, actually, one may be talking and the other one may be seemingly doing. But at the end of the day, I think that both activities have no meaning. I mean, look at the DPRK, for example. I mean, technical experts, and I concur with them, would argue that the piecemeal, shutting down of the Punggye-ri nuclear site is actually just window dressing, because the 3 tunnels that have been blown shut are actually the tunnel entrances that could be reopened again. So that has no meaning. It's reversible, one can argue. The same thing, and I concur with Highway's point. I mean, the lack of a clear policy position. I mean, one could say that Americans are keeping all their options open, but they have so many options that they're simply confusing everybody about where actually do they stand on the issues. And it's not just about the DPRK, it's about everything else in terms of their, dealing with the world.
Okay. Are we picturing two very different personality and certainly strong in their own way, shouting at one another over the table after that door is being closed from the press? Or can we expect that the two of them are looking at the longer picture and united by politics in their own system, in a way, to be together on something that is going to be beneficial for the rest of the world, too?
Yeah. Well, it's very hard to say in my assessment. I mean, body language and the way you behave tells you a lot about who you are. You can't run away from your upbringing. You can't run away from your culture. So just case in point, we know a lot more about Kim Jong-un from the course of this year. When he had a meeting with Xi Jinping, at least on the first occasion when we saw it in Beijing, and he was meeting him, his conduct was actually very interesting. He showed respect for elders, respect for authority. He was taking notes when Xi Jinping was talking to him. When he met President Moon Jae-in, there was sort of a brotherly approach where they were behaving as kin. And even then, Kim Jong-un showed a lot of respect for Moon Jae-in being older than him, not smoking in his presence, which is considered quite, an anathema in Korean culture. But in terms of Kim and Trump coming together, it's hard to say. On the one hand, one scenario, I go with Highway's, depiction of a transactional approach. And I think Mr. Kim, in order to push back on Mr. Trump, has to take on a stronger tone. But on the other hand, Mr. Kim may be more sophisticated and more savvy. He may appeal to Mr. Trump's ego and condescension, right? And begin to let his guard down in order to get some sort of, to extract some sort of benefits by appealing to that ego. So it remains to be seen how he's going to conduct himself.
It could also be interesting to imagine how the other 4 parties that used to be involved in the 6-party talks would look at that, and how they would frame, including China, Russia, Japan, and also the other countries. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that's an important issue, because we've seen over the last few weeks the meetings of various different leaders in the region trying to get their interests represented at this bilateral meeting. So using a business metaphor, I see the coming together of 2 consortiums, so to speak. I mean, this is a bilateral meeting, but on the one side, the DPRK, Mr. Kim Jong-un, has some amount of pressure, if you like, to represent Chinese concerns and Russian concerns. And on the other side, the United States, President Trump is expected to carry some of the South Korean and the Japanese concerns to the table. And this needs a lot of management, because it creates a lot of confusion, a lot of noise. When actually, I go with Taiwan's point. At the end of the day, this meeting is about 2 people trying to establish a working relationship. And if there's no sense of sincerity and trust from each other, you can't talk about all the other issues that involve the 6 parties or the 4 other members.
How will those 4 parties in their respective capitals think about tomorrow's summit and how it's likely they are going to frame it, Tan-Wai?
There are points of unity. The points of unity is that they want to see peace on Korean Peninsula, denuclearization. This is no doubt. All 6 parties are in agreement with this, including North Korea, who has mentioned overtly that that's what they're seeking for. But there are also specific issues for each party's concern. For Russia, for example, it wants to have much more strategic aims in working with China, in working with North Korea, particularly in its recent sort of look-east policy. It has been trying to thaw relations with Japan. It is also strengthening relations with Beijing. And in the case of Japan, definitely after the denuclearization issue, The most important issue for them is the abductees issue, where Japanese nationals were kidnapped in the 1970s, and they want to know the outcome as well as the status of this individual.
Right.
For South Korea, of course, everyone knows that the stake is highest for South Korea because of the artilleries that are pointed towards Seoul, and Seoul is the centerpiece of their economic development.
And the future of the two states.
Yes. Especially its capital
Finally,
city.
for China?
And for China, very important player in this whole issue, because this is a neighbor of China. China was a major participant in the 50 to 53 conflict, where it sent volunteers to participate in the war. And also, there are many other issues in the sense that if North Korea is able to denuclearize, open up, I think China would be a major player in the economic development of Pyongyang as well as North Korea in general. And they have the capacity to do so. Remember, the most important foreign diplomacy tool in Beijing is the Belt and Road Initiative, and North Korea has expressed interest in joining the BRI.
We don't want to forget another country, Singapore. Both of you are coming from Singapore. There's a high-stake meeting for Singapore future. One-liner, if we can. What would that mean for Singapore? Make it or break it?
Make it, certainly. And if we can play some small way in contributing to the organization of a smooth-going summit, I think that's a very good start.
Yeah,
Singapore is a neutral facilitator. We've seen it playing an objective neutral role since the Wangpu talks to the CIMA talks. And now, I think today it was revealed that Singapore is spending $20 million on this summit itself. So that's our contribution to sort of world peace and peace on Korean Peninsula.
I guess it's not just money-wise, but something else as well. Thank you so much, Lin Tan Wai and Graham Ong Webb. Really appreciate it. And that is all the time we have for our special program on the DPRK US Summit, brought to you live from Singapore. If you'd like to see more, search CGTN into your search engine or check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and see the Weibo from me, Tian Wei. And everyone, for my team here in Singapore and back in Beijing, thanks for watching. And tune in again tomorrow for more insight from across China and around the world. And make sure to tune in for our latest information and comments about the DPRK US Summit. Thank you for being with us. Bye for now.